Ann Cummins, and I am on the board of grit2, which is Growing Resiliency in Teams Together. We are a Downers Grove-based group that puts together parents and students with resources regarding mental wellness and mental health. And we are really, really excited to be here tonight, and for all of you to be here tonight. I'd like to quickly just recognize our board members and advisory members that are here. So if our board members could stand up for just a second. Yeah, you guys. These wonderful people have donated a lot of their time to helping service this community and our kids, and I really just can't tell you how hard they work. We have Megan Jacobson in the back, Lisa Ordway, Erin Gu, Kristen Novak, Lori Doy, Julie Reed, Sara Deal. If you see them later and you have a question, please seek them out. They can answer them and help you. And then I'd also like to thank and recognize our advisory board members who are professionals in the community that we utilize to help drive our content and give us recommendations. If you guys could stand up. I also know you are Sara. Mickey Dewell, Matt Newstead, Sandra McDonald, and then a few of our panel members are on our advisory board. So we just wanted to thank them so much. We are so excited to have this tonight. This has been planned for a while, or at least something we wanted to do for a while. Naperville did something about a year ago. We love it. We love it. But they did something similar because, as we all know, unfortunately, this is a hard time for our youth. We are in a mental health crisis, and we're going to talk more about some of the reasons why. But it's not something that we're going to solve with one person or one organization, and it's a time for communities to come together. And that's really what we want to happen tonight, is just to start a conversation, to start sharing information and resources, and start thinking about new things we can be doing as a community for our youth. So the night's going to be divided into two sections, basically. We're going to have a panel discussion with our panel. We have some prepared questions that were submitted, and then we'll also, if there are any audience questions, we will throw it out to the audience as well. If you would rather write your question, there are note cards at your seat where you could write it and give it to one of the grit2 members, or just pass to the side and we'll grab it and read it. And then the second part is some local organizations, nonprofit and businesses that are going to be here afterwards that you can visit and talk to and learn about the many amazing resources that are available to us. And I think that's also one of the reasons we're here, is starting to work more in this space every day. It's, oh, I didn't know we had that. I didn't know we did that. There's a DG Did You Know sheet on your chair, because things we didn't really know existed, and we want to keep sharing information and keep helping the community find out what's going on. So without further ado, let's get to our panel members. Thank you so much for being here. We are so blessed to have this group and to hear from them tonight. I'm going to let each member introduce themselves, their organization, and their role, and then we'll get into some questions. Erin, do you want to start?
Here we go. Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Ludwick. I'm with Downers Grove North High School. I'm actually an associate principal of student support services, so I have the pleasure of working with our mental health professionals that are on site, as well as teachers, other administrators, and staff.
Hello, my name is Brian Lauterwasser. I'm the manager of the Adolescent Inpatient Unit and the Eating Disorder Service Line at Benedictine Hospital, and excited to be here.
Hello, good evening. I'm Barry Kincaid. I'm a school counselor at O'Neill Middle School. My picture is the Kool-Aid Man, by the way, if you want to take a quick look at that. I think it's very fitting for the middle school level, trying to connect with students. I work with our 8th graders currently, and we loop with students, so we're a 7th and 8th grade middle school.
I'm Sara Courington. I'm the Associate Principal for Student Support Services at Downers Grove South High School, so I am Dr. Ludwick's counterpart. And once again, we work with all of the mental health professionals in the building to just continue to find the best ways to support our students. And Barry looking at this panel photo and really wishing that I was a little more creative. Hello everyone, my name is Betsy Boesch and I am the Assistant Director of Youth and Family Services at the DuPage County Health Department. And we provide outpatient mental health services to a variety of folks throughout the county. But I'm here today to talk more about the services that we provide to youth, especially post-crisis here in the county.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I'm Peggy Tomchek. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor and I'm the counseling coordinator right now at Benedictine University. I come from a private practice background where I worked extensively with LGBTQ plus folks and I'm really excited to be here and be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the first questions we have is, the question is, how did we get here? Why are our youth experiencing such intense mental health issues versus generations before? So just a tiny little question. And we're going to throw it to Ryan first.
Yeah, thank you, Ann. I'll do my best to answer this question as quickly as I can. It is a big question and try to figure out how you wrap it all up, and I'll try to do it in a way that's hopefully makes sense in some way. So I'd like you to start by picturing this gobstopper, and at the center of the gobstoppers is like sugary goodness, and the sugary goodness are our youth. That's what it is. And we're trying to protect them in some ways, and there's these layers around them, and there's different factors, I think, that influence their overall mental wellness and health, and what's led us here. But if we take that concept of saying, okay, there's layers around these youth, I want to start with this acronym, since we're technologically, I guess, challenged society in some ways, IFAM comments, right? So IFAM comments really starts, the I is for individual. So when we think about what are individuals like that might lead to mental wellness or health issues, we want to look at cultural factors. We want to look at ethnic factors, genetic predispositions, right? There's a lot of research that shows that puberty is having an earlier onset. So what does that mean overall for our youth in terms of physically they're developing faster, but brain development is not equal to their physical development, right? So that creates this neurological mix-up. So kids are being stimulated at these younger ages in pubescent age. It's not just about reproduction, right? It's about this social integration and the brain's preparedness to be able to socially integrate and think of concepts like hierarchy and concepts like competition and things like that, right? So as our youth are developing faster, but their brain is not, you've got this discord. And it can feel overwhelming for people who can't process or really get sensitized with the information. And how does that contribute? Does it contribute to feelings of inadequacy, internalizing things, because they just haven't developed equally between physical and neurological development, right? So that's something from this I individual we want to look at. The layer around that, the FAM, is about family, right? Looking at our family constellation and family makeups, it is a different family, right? I think the show Modern Family is a great depiction of what modern family really looks like and what it's about, right? So it's this idea that it's different. There's a lot more blended families. There's a lot more step-parents, step-siblings, half-siblings. There's kids that are going from home to home, trains half at dad's house, half at mom's house, right? And so maybe living with grandparents. But this idea of what the family makeup is, single-parent homes, and what does that look like? And then what is the family predisposition? Is there mental illness in my family? Did my parents have it? Am I growing up in a home where my parents can't regulate emotions, and what I'm learning, the social modeling I'm seeing in my home is that this is how you respond to crisis. This is what you're supposed to do, right? So it's influential. So after the family, the calm of comments is really about community. So looking at the school, looking at school academic performance, clubs, activities, sports, things like that. What are they involved in? Who are the influential people? Do I feel like I can keep up academically? Do I feel a lot of pressure? When I think about DuPage County and the pressure for success and to succeed, right? So I have 4 daughters. I have a senior, a junior, an 8th grader, and a 6th grader. So when my older 2 started high school, I told them, if you want to take AP classes, knock yourself out, you can take them. That's not my expectation for you. My expectation for you is that you graduate high school with grades that you're proud of and with a well-rounded approach, right? So, and some of them have decided to take AP classes. That's great. If they want to take 8 AP classes, I'm probably going to have a serious conversation with them about, like, are you able to keep up with that from a workload standpoint and from a social life standpoint? But this community that they're involved in, I think, influences this idea of, am I good enough? Am I smart enough? Can I keep up? And things like that. So the ENT is about environment, right? So where do I live? What does my household look like? Am I living in do I have access to resources? Do I live in a polluted area? Am I exposed to a pandemic of some sort, right? This is environment. So it's interesting because so in 2019, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out and said that mental health issues have surpassed physical conditions for adolescents at this point, right? And that was 2019, pre-pandemic. So the research shows that from 2009 to 2019, increase in depression, anxiety, right? So it's 40% increase in this expressions of sadness and hopelessness. And suicide thoughts had increased 35%. And suicide like gestures had increased like 45%. And students are youth age 10 to 24, there's a 57% suicide rate between 2009 and 2019, all pre-pandemic. So we already saw these social pressures hitting our youth before COVID was even a thing. And then you hit the pandemic, right? And we all have a lot of thoughts about the pandemic and what it's done to our youth. I can say from an inpatient hospital standpoint, we were the busiest we've ever been the last 2 years. We saw more kids admitted because of anxiety, social isolation, depression, feeling like they lost things. There was 140,000 kids in a report that came out in June of 2021. There's 140,000 kids that lost a caregiver to the pandemic. So if you think about just adverse childhood experiences and trauma, like that's significant. That like my parent died, or my grandparent died, or my older sister, or whoever's taking care of me, they passed away because of COVID, right? So this pandemic is influential, and it's something we got to look at. And then as we look past the pandemic, and the S of comments is really about society, right? And this is about what are the societal pressures, what are the strengths, what are the opportunities. Society is about racial discrimination. It's about technology, right? So if you think about 2020 when the pandemic hit, what else was going on, right? A really contentious election, right? Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, like these really intense. Asian Americans are being kind of blamed for this like pandemic. A lot of racial discrimination, a lot of divide in the country, a lot of probably divide in people's homes. So people, adolescents that went to social media, they got really radical views about things. And did we as caregivers, as parents, did we have those conversations with our youth, or did we allow them to go down these like Facebook trails, Reddit trails, all this social media stuff, to kind of get the information they want, right? So, but again, influential, right? The other thing that's really interesting to note, and then this is correlated data, not causal data, is that the iPhone came out in 2007, right? By 2009, it was mainstream. Most people who could have an iPhone had an iPhone by 2009. That time period of 2009 to 2019 is when we saw the increase of all this depression, anxiety in youth. Correlated. The iPhone is not the demise of our youth, our generation, right? So, but there are things about that are significant. During that time, teen pregnancy drops. You're like, hey, that's so great. Is it so great? Kids sitting in their room, in their devices, on their technology, not hanging out. The statistic that's not reported is that adolescent pornography went up. So teen pregnancy went down, but pornography went up. And so what are our kids learning about relationship and objectification and being healthy? And what are the brain studies show about people who watch pornogaphy, what that does to people, right? So those are things that, again, are influential, causal. Put all these things together, it's clear to see kind of why our youth might be struggling, right? So you and I didn't have a cell phone growing up. We had an embarrassing moment in school, and it's like, oh yeah, that lasted a day, that lasted a week, maybe my friend teased me about it for a month, but nobody recorded it, nobody made a meme out of it, nobody put it on social media, nobody like teased you about it a year later, you're still getting photos of it, you know, that just didn't happen to us when we were growing up. So those are things I think it's important to recognize for our youth. I think those are contributing factors. It's hard to say that any one thing is the reason that we're in this situation today, but society has shifted. Society has changed. You know, you look at the ideal picture of man and woman and what society is saying people should look like, and this self-comparison stuff and things like that. So Instagram, Facebook, so they're not all bad. Research shows that 75% of adolescents use social media in very productive, healthy ways. At the hospital, I see the other 25% of the kids, so it feels like everybody. Like, my kids hate that I work at the hospital because it's like, no, not doing that. Like, let me show them what the research says. Let me show them what I see, right? So, but it's this idea that we just got to be thoughtful. But all those things. So I fan comments this idea of the individual, of our family, our community, our environment, our society, all these things kind of working together really help influence our youth and where they're at today.
Thank you. So being where they're at, what is the current landscape in the community and in DuPage that we're seeing, that what issues are coming to the forefront specifically for us? Betsy, could you address that?
Sure. Can you guys hear me? Okay, yeah, this is working. All right. So earlier this year, the CDC published some data, and I'm going to share that first because I think it's really relevant to what we're seeing kind of throughout the youth in DuPage County. So in 2021, 37% of high school students reported poor mental health. About 44% of those students reported persistent sadness or hopelessness in the last year. About 55% reported emotional abuse by a parent or another adult in the household. LGBTQ plus youth and female youth reported higher rates of poor mental health, of school performance, emotional abuse and higher rates of suicide attempts than their peers. And 36% of youth experienced racism, which affected not only their mental health, but their school performance, and could contribute to lifelong risk behaviors. So those are all very consistent with the landscape that we're seeing out there and the common issues that we're treating these days. Kind of as Ryan spoke to, that lack of connectedness during the pandemic really contributed to many of these things. That always-on culture that he spoke to of, the pressure of being attached to your phone and what that does to social connections and, peer pressure. Also the idea of this instant communication, which can occur on social media, but can also be present, in the news, being always accessible and always there and always having reminders of those things. Many of, the global and the national issues that we've seen play out over the last 3 years. I think it's also something to consider in terms of, schoolwork and constant access to grades and portals and things like that too. That we as kids didn't really always have access to. So these are all things to think about and to think about the widespread impact on mental health that they're having and the pressures that kids are facing these days.
Thank you. So with that going on, with all the factors and all the ways it's exhibiting itself, what specifically are we doing in our schools to address those issues? And Erin, you could address from a high school perspective and Barry from middle.
Sure. So I also grabbed a little bit of data, and it's interesting to hear you talk about yours because ours is pretty much the same. Which I would expect it would mirror the greater society. So just at North specifically, we do a survey called the Illinois Youth Survey. And so it is self-reported, and they're filling it out on their school computers, and they always have to think about how that could impact what they say. But we did see an increase since 2018. We saw a 10% increase of students, so went from 31% to 41% of students reporting on the survey. We don't even get all of them that say that they have felt a significant increase in sadness and depression. And they were labeling that before the pandemic, and again, it was a troubling trend before that. I was clinically an English teacher before I moved up here and became the support services, and so I had a lot to learn about what mental health looked like in schools. And I work with a great team of practitioners who have said, we need to get proactive as soon as possible. And I'm sure I've said that, but then consistently we're in a response mode as well when we experience a community crisis, a loss or something like that, the pandemic also, that shared trauma. We are then tasked with responding to a crisis as well. So one thing I can say about the team in D99 is that we really try to balance how to be proactive with also being crisis response related and therapeutic in our offices. One thing that has come up is kind of the impact that mental health struggles are having on the way that kids are socializing. And we have seen, and students have reported, an increase in peer conflict. And I think when our ninth graders right now, I told the group, I was going to talk about you today, that what we're seeing is our teachers, early on I got a couple like SOS messages, G-chats that were like, come see this class, like it's just strange. And it went up and it took about 15 minutes to be like, ooh, you're acting like a sixth grader. And it made a lot of sense because I thought we took you out of the social environment for a number of years, and then here you are now with already what we know about what's happening biologically, puberty, and you were exhibiting the same kind of maturity, yogurt smearing type behaviors, and no one has told you that this is incorrect yet. You haven't had that social cue. Well, that's causing themselves that same kind of immature reaction to things like conflict. You can't escape it. It's happening. Someone's going to tweet about it later. They're going to talk about it next week. And so you're always in this heightened state of awareness about what other people are thinking about you. So we're trying to be proactive in looking at programming that we can put in place that actually addresses bystanders who witness bias acts or bullying, because a lot of research shows that that's what most effectively schools can do. You can follow up on the victim, support the victim, follow up on the bully, support the bully, but if you can get a social environment where the peers will check that behavior and it's no longer acceptable, that has so much more of an impact than anything that Sara and I can put into place in terms of a homeroom class, because it has to be a culture where we interrupt it, but the adults have to be equally as equipped in that as well. We have to have the same language and not pause when we see something. And so that's one proactive step that I think we're really focusing on this year, because we're seeing a lack of maturity at all levels, but we're seeing, especially with our 9th and 10th graders, just interesting elements of maturity that's playing out in the way that they socially treat each other, and then the negative impact that that has. And then continuing to be responsive, working with our community partners when people need therapy that extends outside of what we can provide them in the academic space. And just keeping that conversation going about groups and support groups and other places that people connect. And a continued focus on belonging, that you, as who you are, fully belong in our school. I think that's a really proactive message that while we don't file it under student support services, it's the general health of our school culture. If you don't have to feel like you have to overthink who you are when you come into the building. And you can focus on your education and you can focus on growing as a human. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to do to address the trends that we're seeing.
So I'll speak to the middle school level. I would definitely agree anxiety and depression are probably the early onset or stages where we start to notice that, particularly in our adolescents. But what I'd also say, and kind of echo in a way, is in addition to those two major concerns, I think attendance, with school refusal, or permissive ability to kind of go when you feel comfortable and try to avoid situations, plays into making it harder to feel like school is a safe place sometimes for some of our adolescents. Behavior is definitely an issue. I think in terms of the changes that students haven't really had that opportunity in some ways to develop the social skills, to have those opportunities to learn kind of the expectations. We actually just this morning at one of our morning meetings talked about like implicitly teaching what are expectations for behavior. When is it appropriate and at what level and volume should you be speaking depending on what's going on in the classroom? When is it appropriate to be using your technology devices and when should you not? So those kind of expectations which sometimes you kind of take for granted that you feel like have been learned. Our students still struggle with that, based on developmentally where we would expect them to be. So behavior and attendance, I think, are big contributors in terms of making it more challenging right now for our youth. In terms of what we're doing at the middle school level, I personally, as our 8th grade counselor, have focused primarily more on doing interactive social skills groups, more so than in the past. And make it a more interactive and not like a lecture-based format, but more of a almost like a physical kind of interactive outlet. So I think some of the best ways students learn is to put them in natural situations. So instead of creating this artificial environment of this is what we need to figure out and do, why not just practice it and actually give them opportunities to learn? So that's kind of my mentality is, in addition to checking in individually like we would normally do with students, focusing primarily on that active-based social opportunity that can be provided through groups, and students tend to love it. So they find it as fun. They don't see it as kind of the purpose of what it kind of serves as in a way, which is even the better part of it, to be honest with you. Because if it feels normal and natural, then students are going to be opposed kind of like on the sheet here, the 5 things teens want you to know, they don't want you to feel like you're fixing them. So if I approach them in that way, it's going to be an automatic turnoff, and they're not going to really listen, care, want to be involved. If I approach it in a way where I'm there just to allow them to share what they want to share and to try to facilitate that in a natural, kind of casual way, they're all in. So to me, that's the best way to approach it. And I would agree, number 1 on this list by far at an adolescent level is really what they would want you to know if I'm speaking on their behalf, from talking to them individually and working with them in groups, is they really want you to be there to listen to what they have to say and be a part of their lives and not feel like they're a problem, but that they're just trying to deal with what's going on and being a part of caring about that and being there to support them, obviously, too. So, so I hope that answers the question. And I don't know.
Yeah, I have a
Well,
couple
if there's anything
more.
else I have.
I have a couple more prepared ones, and then if anyone is having questions, please raise your hand. And I want to get to ones that are here from a live audience. You had mentioned school refusal, so I wanted to
Yes.
jump to this because one that was submitted is, I'm hearing about school refusal. What is that? What do I do if my kid just won't go? Parentheses, he's 6 foot and 200 pounds. I can't make him do anything. Sara,
Yeah.
I think you had some thoughts on that.
Sure. This is a really complex and complicated topic, and I guess what I would like to impart on everyone today is school refusal is a symptom. There is always something that underlies school refusal, and that is one of the most challenging, it's one of the reasons it's one of the most challenging topics that we deal with. So first and foremost, I would say, if you are working with anyone in your family who is struggling with school refusal, take care of yourself. School refusal is a daily struggle at times, and to support somebody who is working through school refusal can be daunting. But most important is that we figure out what is at the root of school refusal. And that can be anything from my classes are overwhelming and I feel anxious. It can be things like I don't have anyone to sit with in the cafeteria. And each of those instances requires a different response. I would say, please don't suffer alone. Reach out to us and do not wait. While we are really happy that mental health days are things that we can excuse school attendance for, we're also tracking that data. And for example, when we see a student that has over 5 days already at the start of the school year, I mean, it's still pretty early on in the school year, that concerns me. It's something that our teams need to know about so that we can intervene as quickly as possible. School refusal has a tendency to only get more difficult over time because that whatever it is that is causing the anxiety usually will snowball. So falling behind in your work just means that there is more work to do, or feeling like you do not belong only feels worse over time. So first and foremost, please reach out to your student's counselor at school. That's always the best first stop, and we will be sure then to connect you to the right resources.
Thank you. Another question we have here is, how do you tell the difference between regular stress, anxiety, and something more serious? Ask Peggy if you would take that one.
Okay, so when you're thinking about stress versus anxiety, a lot of us, first I want to say a lot of times we use words interchangeably for things. So we say like, oh, I'm really stressed out, or I'm really anxious, but they're not really necessarily the same thing. So when you're thinking about stress and you're framing that, I would think about a time when there was an actual event or stressor that occurred in your life that elevated, your adrenaline. That stress response kind of kicks in. So I'm thinking your child went to school to take a bio exam, and 3 days later got the grade back, and it wasn't what they were expecting after a lot of hard work and studying, right? So their grade drops. and maybe they're really concerned about that. So there's an event that has happened that has caused stress. In that moment, there are opportunities to problem solve. There are ways of thinking about how you might approach the next time. You might look at what behaviors you have used to prepare for the exam, so on and so forth. You get the picture, right? So at some point, the stressor has an end. So if you're thinking about like a nice bell curve, you would sort of have this elevation, and then the stressor would resolve, and you would sort of return to your baseline. When we're looking at anxiety, we're looking at a more persistent and constant state of arousal. And by arousal, I mean that stress level goes up, and instead of seeing a nice bell curve that returns to normal, you're sort of plateauing, and it stays, and it remains, and it remains, and then maybe when it returns, over time, it doesn't even return quite to baseline because it's so used to being elevated. So when I'm thinking about it framing, when I see exclusively college students now because I'm on a campus, and I'm looking at students who come in and say, I'm so stressed out, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this, but there's just a persistent and constant worry. Like when you think about, my grandma nicknamed me the worry wart of the family, because if I didn't have one thing to worry about, I found something else, and then when that was the next, you get the picture. So I always look at frequency, duration, and severity. So if your child is coming to you and saying, oh my gosh, I was so stressed out, I couldn't even eat lunch, and then you say, well, how did your afternoon wrap up? Oh, by the time I got to 8th period, I felt great. Okay, that's a very short duration of stress. Frequency is your student coming home, or child coming home every day talking about how nervous or anxious or worried or whatever word they use to describe that feeling of being stressed. And it's every day, and now it's into weeks, and now it's into months, right? So how long is that duration taking place for? And then finally, the severity. How are they functioning? If your child is coming to you and saying, I feel anxious, I feel like I haven't, I haven't been sleeping, I haven't slept in several days. I'm not falling asleep. When I finally get to sleep, I'm not staying asleep. My appetite is suffering. So you're looking at how is the anxiety or worry or stress, or however you're referring to it. And again, it's kind of good and bad that we use those terms interchangeably because they are kind of all the same thing. But what we're talking about here again is that persistent and lasting feeling. And then when you're looking at severity, is it impacting areas of their life and functioning? So it could look like school refusal. It could look like a lack of inability to sleep or stay asleep. It could look like a loss of appetite, a loss of interest in interacting with friends, avoiding social situations. So those are just a few of the things that I look for when I'm looking for, kind of warning signs and how to discern the difference between the two.
So frequency, duration, and severity, looking at those.
And that sounds super clinical, but.
I wrote it down. Are there any questions from the audience? I have some more I can ask too, so no pressure. Yes.
So some of you have talked about how, the students are maybe in their room, on their phones or whatever. Like, as parents, how do we, curb that a little bit? Because I know it's normal. They want privacy. They want to lay in their bed and get all cozy. But, how much is too much? Or is there any tips to help us kind of obviously we're not, I would love it if they would sit and watch TV at night. No kids don't watch TV anymore like that. They watch 5-second videos. But how do we help them not be alone so much on their phones?
I can share something that has come up from talking to parents in the last year, because often when we have a student who's exhibiting a problem with being able to manage the phone in the school environment, you're the first people we call because you pay the bill. And we want to talk to you about that. But in those situations, what I've learned is creating no phone zones is really helpful, and it's not adversarial. Because we're looking to do the same things in schools, right? Teach them the appropriate time to engage with that, and even starting that's a boundary, right? You're creating a boundary that they process. You can still be involved and connected. That FOMO isn't there, because one of the hardest things is once if you do take the device, then there's many ways to still stay connected that then you don't know about at all. But I had a couple parents who said that has been really helpful, the no phone zones, like dinner is a good one to start, is what parents said, because it's like, clearly I want you to interact with me. But then also like almost a phone curfew, because it's what's happening at night. We found out as we've worked with parents, that it's like after hours is when stuff gets a little weird, you know, and a little hinky. And so like then having that kind of, everyone's like, puts their phone in the kitchen to charge. Use a different alarm. There's other alarms, there's real alarms. Actual ones. But parents have said like that has helped, because then when you do have to have a conversation and you think something's funny going on, or the energy isn't right, they're in their phone, we know that we feel that energy shift. It's easier to address because you've already made that a topic of the conversation. I'm not a parent, I've not done this myself, but I've heard parents say that's been really helpful to take the fight out of it, kind of.
One of the things I want to say that Dr. Ludwick really touched base on is that it's parental hierarchy, right? So somewhere along the way, our roles flipped and our kids got in charge. And I'm not sure where that happened or how that happened. That could have been a generation of parents that were like, I don't want to do it like my parents did it. They were so strict and so rigid. I want to, I don't know. But it's a clear trend that we see at the hospital where kids often hold the power of the families, right? Their mental health, they hold their parents hostage with mental health, like, oh, well, if you don't do that for me, then I'm going to hurt myself. I'm going to self-injure. I'm going to do whatever. Phones is very similar. It's almost like kids are in a relationship with their phone in some ways, right? So taking the phone away feels like I'm breaking up with somebody that's very close to me. And how dare you take that away from me? We do a lot of the safety country with the no phone zones or things like that. But I really want to empower parents to say, you do pay the bill. It's a privilege. It's not a right. Somewhere along the way, kids kind of feel like it's their right to have this one. How dare you take that away? And it's like, you can have it as long as you're being appropriate. So let's talk about what the expectations are for the family and how I expect you to interact with us. When do I expect you to be present in the family? And I mean, my kids have come downstairs and sat on the couch with me and have started to pull out their phone. And I'm like, oh, no. I know you don't really like football right now, and that's okay, but this is something you're doing for me as your dad. For 30 minutes, you can sit with me and you can do this, and we can chat and you don't need to be on your phone. And then I'll go do something that you like to do, and I'll come join you in your activity. And I think parents need to be willing to do that. If I want to restrict or I want to change the culture, am I willing to go to them? And am I willing to meet them on their level and do that? And not just expect them to follow all my rules, but am I willing to invest in the relationship? And so you can't be on your phone because we're going to do this instead. Or the no phone zone is because we have this activity set up. And so, but I'd really like to encourage parents to feel like, we can set the values for our home, and we can set the structure of how we want to be that, and expect our kids to follow that, and that can be okay. It can be a good lesson in hierarchy.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. From the middle school level, like I was saying with groups, for example, in addition to the phones and the technology, I think it's also important to encourage that interaction. So involvement, I think, is also a great way, especially in adolescence, like socialization and being with peers and wanting to feel respected, connected to peers is probably the top priority most of the time, at least for middle school. So yes, technology can be limited, but I think it's also important to, I would almost expect, I mean, I'll speak as a parent, I have a son and daughter, our expectation is they do at least one or two activities that are connected to school. Or if they can't find one, they need to do something in the community. So being involved in something besides just sitting at home and being connected to social media is a great way to be involved with other people and to do that in a more real, authentic way, similar to what I was talking about with groups. The more connected they are with students in real life instead of through their phone, the better off they're going to probably be, and the more they're going to feel connected to their peers. So I would encourage expectations of actually making sure they're involved in something, because typically the most people get involved and get to know people is through the activities they do as they get older. I mean, they don't have time really to necessarily just hang out in the neighborhood anymore. It becomes much more focused on what they're involved in. So encouraging that and making that an expectation and making that a part of their life outside of school, outside of just being on social media, gives them something else in their day besides academics and, their phone. So I would encourage that.
Just
one last piece to offer. There are 5 children in my house. They range in age from 7 to 15. We have a lot of devices. And what I have realized over time is that tech companies have gotten a lot better at what they will offer us as parents in order to help with some of this. So, for example, there is a great app called Bark. Bark is my best friend because Bark goes in and monitors the messages my children are sending, and it will even send me an alert if there is something that is troublesome. And it could be something as simple as my daughter had texted and said, I don't feel very well today. And Bark sent me an alert that said medical concern. And I was able to follow up on it, and that was great. I'd rather have to deal with the notification than not know. The other thing that I would offer is if you are an iPhone family, I don't have much Android experience, but iPhone is great at being able to set screen time rules and time in which you're able to access certain apps. When I came home after work today, my daughter didn't want to work on math. She wanted to take out her phone and look at TikTok instead. And it didn't go so well, and I could feel myself starting to amp up a little bit, so I walked out of the room and then, picked up my phone and jammed the button to turn off her screen time access. But I was able to do that then and take away the distraction without us getting into it and escalating and me actually having to go and physically take the phone. So I'm really a fan of some of the technological tools now around this as well, because it just helps to just make it easier to sometimes avoid that fight, but also get where you want to get.
Any other questions? We had a question here. If my child tells me they're struggling, or I think if you notice an escalation of what they're going through, what's my first step? What do I do? Betsy, I'm gonna ask you to take that one, because we went right down the line.
Of course, yes. So I think it's important to approach the situation stating your observations. So we call these I statements in therapy, but to approach the situation from your perspective. It comes across very non-judgmentally. You can simply state the facts of what you're observing, or you can state your own feelings about the situation. So approaching them in a way to say, I'm concerned, I am worried about you. It looks to me like you may be struggling, those sorts of things. And that may open up a conversation. The other thing that I would say is to be aware of your environment when initiating these conversations. It's really important to create a sense of privacy and a sense of safety when having these really sensitive conversations. It's probably not something to bring up at the dinner table with brothers and sisters and maybe other people in the household. It's definitely something to be addressed in private. So create that space to have these conversations so that your child can open up in a way that they might not in other settings. If you are concerned that they are suicidal, you need to ask if they are suicidal. And it's a really, really, really hard thing to ask. I ask it every day, almost every day in my professional life. And the few times I've had to ask it of a loved one, it's a very difficult conversation to have. So I understand that that's a hard word to say. It's a very hard thing to talk about. And it's really, really scary on both sides. But it is really important that you use the word suicide when asking that question, because they may be having thoughts of hurting themselves and not taking their life. And it's really, really important to distinguish between those two types of behavior. So it is really important to ask that question directly. If they respond yes, that they are, then further action needs to be taken. So you may need to ask some more questions to determine how far they've thought this out. Do you have a plan for killing yourself? Have you thought about how you would do it? Those are appropriate questions to ask in that type of situation. You want to clarify the details and understand what level of planning they've come to around their suicidal thoughts. Because if they have thought it through, then more urgent action needs to be taken in that situation. I would encourage you all to kind of practice these questions. It sounds ridiculous, but it is important. It's important to become comfortable talking about these things, especially in those types of situations, because they're really stressful They're really emotionally charged. You know, you're with somebody you love and care about, but it's really important that you get the right information in those types of situations. If you do need to connect your child or somebody you care about to help, there are lots of resources, some of which are on the back of this flyer. You can call 988. Yes, it's just those 3 numbers now. Just dial 988 and have access to 24/7 crisis counselors who can help you to assess the situation and determine what to do. They can also provide support even if you or your loved one is not suicidal. They can help get connected to resources. Maybe if there's less urgency around the situation, get you connected to a therapist or resources for more support. So that's a great resource that can be accessed at any time, at 3 in the morning or, you know, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's a great one to have on hand. It's now much easier to remember as well. So that is why they switched over to the 988 number. And the health department does answer those calls. So you are usually getting connected to somebody local who's familiar with the resources in our community and can get you connected to those. Another resource, and I don't know if it's on here, but I have lots of cards with me, is for the DuPage County Crisis Line. That number is 630-627-1700. Again, another 24/7 resource where you can call and get support and help kind of get some guidance in any type of situation. But I would say to kind of approach those situations in a very sensitive and in a way where you're creating safety for the person that you're concerned about, and to be direct in asking about any suicidal behaviors.
I think sometimes the fear is, I'm sorry, very quickly, is if I bring up suicide, then I'm implanting the idea in their head.
No, that is one of the biggest myths about suicide. If they are suicidal, likely they have already thought through it, they have already thought about how they might do it, and honestly, bringing it up often serves as a relief. You are probably going to be the first person that's been brave enough to ask them about it, and that's going to be a huge sense of relief to them. So it's important that you approach those conversations with a sense of confidence and comfort, so that you're not further stigmatizing those feelings, because I think a lot of people are afraid to bring them up because of the stigma they've felt for so long.
Barry, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, in addition to the resources that were mentioned in Downers Grove, for our K-8 district, there's also the Safe to Help hotline, which is trained crisis professionals that can respond to any kind of crisis or threat. So it does direct those calls based on the concern. I think it just speaks to the fact that obviously mental health is becoming a bigger overall general concern that we're facing collectively, not just with our youth, but just as a community. So the fact we have all these resources and we're talking about them says something in itself. The one thing I would go back to is number 1 on those 5 things teens want you to know. If you feel like it's hard to have that conversation and you feel that urge as a parent, which is natural, to feel like you've got to fix that problem, so to speak, or talk in a way as if it is a problem to your son or daughter, I would say to really consider, if it's hard for you to do it, which can be the case, then who would be a good person they could talk to? Oftentimes we get calls from parents as a counselor in the middle school, and sometimes it's much more easier. I'll be honest, as a parent myself, it's not as easy in that parent role to be that person sometimes, and that's okay. So who could be that person, and who would they feel comfortable talking to? Sometimes it could be another family member, to be honest with you. Sometimes it could be someone at school. Oftentimes, if you're feeling like you're having a difficult time, then I would encourage you to reach out and see who are those people that can try to help you through that process too. Because it's not easy, as everyone was mentioning, not only to talk about it, but to feel like your students are going to be able to want to have a conversation with you being their parent. So oftentimes I hear that a lot in terms of that I think it's the perception that they think you're going to try to fix them. So instead, they just want someone that they feel comfortable talking to, that's just going to listen, hear what they have to say, and be able to kind of help them through that journey that they're going through. So sometimes someone such as a school counselor or someone else that's connected to school or even connected to the family can be great resources if it's hard for you personally to feel like you can talk about those topics or feel like those topics and conversations tend to go well between you and your son or daughter.
One question, what are your thoughts on getting kids into therapy preventatively? Peggy, do you want to jump on that one?
So, this one doesn't matter, so it's working. I think there are benefits to getting your kids into therapy preventatively. First of all, as I talked about earlier, when somebody's experiencing severe anxiety or another mood disorder like depression, there's already stuff going on. So, as I said earlier, if you're in a situation where you're highly anxious, it's really, really hard to learn coping skills and coping strategies to kind of work through anxiety when you're consistently activated. So preventative therapy can be a good idea just for learning coping skills, for learning different techniques of calming yourself, of interacting with others, of learning about conflict resolution, just things relationally. I mean, there's so many things that you can actually learn in therapy. I mean, we tend to hear kind of the big words like anxiety and depression and stress and all of that. I think it's also really important, I mean, raise your hand if you take your kids once a year for a physical. You do that? Okay, if you have adolescents, they're doing a questionnaire when they walk in to check in on their mood, right? The PHQ-9, I think everybody uses. So we have to remember that the message we're sending our kids is that our mental wellness is just as important as our physical wellness. And sometimes when our mental wellness is suffering, our physical wellness isn't doing well either. Like, if you're highly stressed, you might have like aches and pains. You might turn over in the middle of the night and wake up because your lower back hurts. I don't know anybody who would have that, but it's just an example. So think about those things when you're thinking about what you think your child might need. I'm well aware that there are also barriers to that. Cost obviously is a factor. Therapy is not cheap in most cases. Not everybody's insurance plan covers mental health. So, and accessibility. So I don't know, I know there are a lot of private practitioners here tonight. When I left my private practice, we were booked, beyond booked, waitlisting, 3-month waits. Like, I know a lot of friends who are reaching out right now looking for people and are hearing like, we just don't have any openings. So accessibility is a big thing right now, particularly. What I would encourage in terms of like cost and accessibility is many private practices have graduate interns who will work at their practices, getting hours of experience, and would work at a low to no cost option, maybe a cash out of pocket. At the private practice I worked at in Naperville, I want to say sessions were $10, and the graduate interns have done all the required core coursework, and they're being supervised by an LCPC or an MCSW, sorry. So ask about those options also, and ask, don't be afraid when you call somewhere to say, this is what I can afford. Because oftentimes, my insurance doesn't cover mental health, and when I just found my new therapist, she said, what are you comfortable paying? And I sort of threw out a number, and she said, good, okay, let's go, great. So those are just a couple of thoughts. The other thing I wanted to add was the most important, or in my opinion, the most important predictor of success with therapy is the relationship with the therapist. So when you're going in to meet this new person who is a complete and total stranger that your mom or dad or parent just set you up with, and you're feeling like you're not feeling well already, it's such an intimidating thing to sit down with somebody and talk about your suffering. It's so vulnerable. So when you consider those options for your children or loved ones, remember that relationship that is built with the therapist is one of the biggest predictors of success, and is the relationship. That they have a trusted person who's not you or you that they can talk to and that they can open up to. And over time, that relationship grows, and it can be just such a valuable resource going into adulthood.
We have just a couple more minutes. I want to get everyone out here on time. Were there any other questions from the floor that people had? No? I'm gonna kind of just let you guys riff. Just throw out, there's one thing, we just have a few minutes, that you're like, oh, I just wish I could tell all parents this, or all communities this, or just something you really would like to share to help us as a community and us as parents. Just a big love.
Start on your end this time.
Sure. We'll start at the back. I would say don't be afraid to be vulnerable with your kids. Don't be afraid to talk about your own suffering or times when you felt the way that they're describing that they felt with you, because those stories that you have from your adolescence or your 20s or whatever your experience was, let them know that you're not alone and that you're not just this person in the hierarchy who's above them, that you've had experiences and you've lived a life too. So I think vulnerability is a really great connector for just about anybody, and when we share our suffering, we become closer. So that would be my advice.
Barry kind of talked about this earlier, but just listen. Just being there to listen. If you don't know what to say, that's okay. Oftentimes you don't need to say anything. Just being there to listen and to validate how they're feeling can be really, really powerful in these times.
One of the best pieces of advice I ever received was from a student. And they said, the staff members that I really appreciate just trust what I have to say. They don't second guess me, they don't question what it is I'm saying, and if there's another motive, they take me at my word. And I thought that was one of the most just true forms of expression of what it means to be respected and loved. And I would say let's trust our kids. They are telling us the truth nearly always when it comes to how they're feeling. At least the truth from their perspective, which is just as valid as anyone else.
I'm going to refrain and go last, if that's okay. Thank you.
Pressure off of a mic drop moment or anything.
So I would say most teens want connection with their parents. They may not outwardly say that or express that, but there's something inherent in each of us that we do want that parental love, acceptance, and they want that relationship. It's our job as the parent to find opportunities to connect and to make ourselves available. Going back to the kid that's in their room and they're on the cell phone, we want to create these judgment-free zones. So going into the room and busting through the door and saying like, I can't believe how lazy you are, you're not doing anything, you're just here, like that may not be the best way to connect, right? So opening the door and saying, I can see that you're using your phone as a strategy to occupy your time. I'm not sure that that's really the best situation. Can we talk about another strategy that you can occupy your time? Because it takes away this like, you're lazy, what are you doing? This like, shame, guilt concept, right? So judgment-free means we're going to find ways to connect with our kids that invite discussion, that invite communication, that stay away from labels. And when you're fighting and arguing, model the behavior you want to see with your kids. I can't tell you how many sessions I've been a part of where parents escalate and start swearing, and then they get mad that their kids are swearing at them, and it's like, model the behaviors you want to see from your children. If you want them to learn to stay composed when they're upset, model how to do that, because they're going to follow your example.
Thank you. I'm going to echo something you had mentioned about just students feeling expectations, children feeling expectations on them. That is the number one stressor that students in D99 have identified, is the expectations they feel are put on themselves academically, but also socially. And everything that everyone's talking here, you can see how we're living in a time where that's really difficult for them. So I would just say be mindful of the fact that expectations are coming from all around them. And then they want you to say something. If you see and have concerns, they want you to say something. It hurts to be unnoticed. And so if they're living with you, to feel like you're suffering in silence only compounds. So see it, say it, they're your family and you love them.
All right, so I thought about this, and I'm going to give you my secret. So it's summed up in 2 words, and it goes back to that picture I talked about. If you guys know the Kool-Aid Man, there's a catchphrase the Kool-Aid Man says. So to me, that's my way of reminding myself that things are going to get hard and that's okay. And it's more of that grit mentality of like, it's okay that it's not okay. It's okay that things are hard. And when they get hard, the things that I think made me be able to be a counselor for over 15 years now are the essentials to, I think, kind of counseling 101 in a way, which is if you lead in a non-judgmental way and you have empathy and you're really focused on just building that relationship and that positive regard and treating them in a positive manner, that itself will almost always lead to a much more productive and better conversation and the opportunity for you to find some headway in whatever it is you need to discuss. So I like to think of it as, oh yeah, I've used it as a catchphrase. I've coached cross country for some of you who might know me, as well as other sports too. So I think counseling is a lot like coaching, which to me is a lot like parenting. And I'm a parent myself, and I'll be the first to admit I'm not a great parent. And that's okay, because it's hard. It's not easy. So I have a wonderful wife who is much better at being that parent in situations too, because it's hard for me to not want to try to fix things. So I can speak on my own personal account that it does, if you're feeling like you're part of that situation and causing that situation to not go well, then you have to consider that that's not the student's fault. That might be in part what you're bringing to that situation. And it's hard to not admit that, but sometimes you got to be honest with yourself. So again, it's that oh yeah mentality, and when things get hard, that's okay. How can I deal with it in a way that allows us to go back to those non-judgmental approach with empathy and leading with positivity? If you can do that, chances are pretty good. And that's it.
Thank you. Well, thank you. We're so excited that we had this time with you. Thank you for giving us your guidance. I think it can be a daunting and overwhelming experience to be a parent and to see all the statistics about our kids. And there are so many, and I think more and more we learn there's so many resources, there's so many supports, and people are really all wanting the same thing, and that's for our kids to be healthy, productive individuals. We're going to break, and we can visit the resource fair tables, and I just wanted to introduce a few of them. We have some clinicians and counseling offices that are here, Alder Grove, the Center for Creative Arts Therapy, Ellie Mental Health, Irving and Associates, and Whole Health Counseling. We have 2 inpatient or partial hospitalization organizations, and they also have outpatient services, Linden Oaks and Timberline Knolls. We have some non-traditional organizations, the Center for Healing and Integration, Positive Therapy Troop. I don't know if you know which one that is. The one with the dog. And Strictly Self-Defense. And then finally, we have a number of nonprofit organizations, the Downers Grove Public Library, who I'd like to give a special thanks to for all their help. DuPage, Navigate Adolescence, the YMCA, and Youth Outlook. So thank you very much. I hope we continue to have conversations and work together as a community. And if you have any thoughts for us as an organization or things you'd like to talk about, we will be roaming around. We also have a survey that we would really appreciate if you guys would fill out and give to us, and you will be in a drawing for a $50 Target gift card. Pretty exciting. So I think that's it, unless anyone had anything to add. We can go visit our resource tables. Thanks again. We really appreciate everyone being here.